Greetings to you on our channel. Today we delve into the corridors of history to examine a question that has defined the modern era of the Middle East. For decades, the narrative has been told that the absence of a Palestinian state is solely the result of external forces and missed opportunities. But what do the archives truly reveal? Was there ever a genuine desire among the Arab leadership to build a state of their own alongside Israel? Or was the pursuit of sovereignty always secondary to a darker, more absolute goal? We go back to the documents, the telegrams, and the secret meetings that shaped our world. So, let us begin. The air in Lake Success, New York, in late November of 1947 was thick with the weight of a dying empire and the birth pangs of a new world. Inside the temporary headquarters of the United Nations, the corridors echoed with the hushed whispers of diplomats from 57 nations. The British mandate was crumbling, and the world was tasked with solving the Palestine problem. For the Jewish people, it was a moment of existential hope, the culmination of 2,000 years of longing. But for the leadership of the Arab world, it was a moment of defiant refusal. Document 811 from the United Nations archives records the atmosphere of that fateful week. The Jewish agency, led by David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Shertak, had already begun the painstaking work of drafting a constitution, organizing health services, and building the infrastructure of a functioning democracy. They were ready to say yes to a compromise that offered them only a sliver of their ancestral homeland. In contrast, the representatives of the Arab Higher Committee sat in the plush chairs of the General Assembly with an entirely different agenda. Jamal al-Husseini, the spokesman for the committee, stood before the delegates and made his position clear. His words, preserved in the official records of the 128th meeting, were not about the borders of a future Arab state or the welfare of its citizens. They were about the absolute impossibility of Jewish sovereignty in any form. He spoke of blood and fire, warning that any attempt to partition the land would be met with total resistance. There was no counter-proposal, no alternative map, no plan for an independent Palestinian administration. The records show that while the Jewish leadership was debating the merits of a central bank, the Arab Higher Committee was focused exclusively on the mechanics of a boycott and the mobilization of irregular militias. The scene shifts to the cold, damp offices of the British National Archives at Kew, specifically folder F0371, which contains the frantic correspondence of the final months of the mandate. Sir Alan Cunningham, the last British High Commissioner, wrote with increasing desperation about the vacuum of leadership in the Arab sector. He noted that while the Jewish state-in-waiting was operating with the efficiency of a Swiss watch, the Arab leadership was paralyzed by internal rivalries and a singular obsession with the destruction of the Zionist project. The documents reveal a startling truth. The Arab League, meeting in the Syrian town of Bludan and later in Alais, Lebanon, was not discussing the establishment of a Palestinian government. Instead, they were arguing over which Arab capital would control the territory once the Jews were pushed into the sea. The tragedy of the Palestinian people began not with the lack of land, but with a leadership that viewed a state as a mere byproduct of a military victory that never came. Arthur Penhalagon, a junior clerk in the Jerusalem Secretariat, spent the spring of 1948 filing away the remains of 30 years of British rule. He remembered the smell of burning paper in the courtyards of the King David Hotel, where the British administration was frantically shredding documents before the May 14th deadline. In his private diaries, later published in a limited historical edition, Arthur described a conversation with an Arab colleague named Mahmoud, Mahmud was a middle-class civil servant who dreamed of a stable future for his children in an independent state. But when Mahmud asked his leaders for instructions on how the new Arab administration would function after the British left, he was told to be patient and prepare for the liberation. There were no forms, no tax codes, no plans for schools. The orders coming from the Mufti in Cairo were simple. Do not cooperate with the partition. Do not build. Only wait for the armies to arrive. The 1947 partition plan, known as UN Resolution 181, offered the Arabs of Palestine a state that included the heartlands of Judea and Samaria, the Galilee, and a significant portion of the coastal plain. It was a viable, contiguous territory. Yet the archival evidence from the Arab League's Secretary-General, Abdul Rahman Azam Pasha, reveals a chilling lack of interest in this offer. In a famous interview given to the Egyptian press and documented by British intelligence, Azam Pasha declared that this would be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades. These were not the words of a man seeking a peaceful two-state solution. They were the words of a leadership that preferred a vacuum of power to a shared neighborhood. The historical record is clear. The Arab rejection was not about the borders of the state, but the very existence of the Jewish neighbor. In the Jewish quarters of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the lights stayed on through the night as committees met to finalize the Declaration of Independence. They were working under the shadow of an imminent invasion, yet they prioritized the creation of a legal framework that would protect all citizens, including the Arab minority. The People's Administration, or Minhelet Haam, was a shadow government that had been functioning for months. They had stamps, they had a postal service, they had a police force. In the files of the Central Zionist Archives, one can find the detailed plans for the Emergency Committee that managed food supplies and water. Across the divide, in the Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem and Gaza, there was no such preparation. The documents from the Arab Higher Committee show that their only state-building activity was the recruitment of the Holy Jihad Army, a disorganized group of fighters whose primary goal was sabotage. The disparity between the two movements was not just military, it was intellectual and civic. The Zionist movement, rooted in the Enlightenment and the desperate need for a refuge, understood that a state is built from the bottom up, through labor, institutions, and law. The Arab leadership of that era, dominated by the Husseini clan, viewed the situation through the lens of feudal power and religious struggle. They believed that the surrounding Arab kingdoms, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, would simply march in and hand them the land. This reliance on external force meant that the internal work of nation-building was neglected. A secret report from the British Intelligence Bureau in Cairo, dated March 1948, noted that the Palestinian Arabs are being led by men who are more interested in their own prestige in the Arab world than in the actual welfare of the local population. On the night of May 14, 1948, as the last British soldiers lowered the Union Jack at the port of Haifa, the Jewish state was proclaimed in a modest museum in Tel Aviv. The ceremony lasted only 32 minutes. It was a masterpiece of restraint and determination. Ben-Gurion read the scroll, and a nation was reborn. At that very moment, according to the memoirs of Glub Pasha, the British commander of the Jordanian Arab Legion, the armies of 5 Arab nations were crossing the borders. They did not come to establish a Palestinian state. They came to carve up the map for themselves. King Abdullah of Jordan had his eyes on Jerusalem and the West Bank. King Farouk of Egypt wanted Gaza and the Negev. The documents show that there was no agreement among the invaders to create an independent Palestine. The liberation was in reality a land grab by neighboring monarchs. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the Arab world chose to ignore the legal reality of the UN resolution. By rejecting the half a loaf offered in 1947, they ensured that their people would have nothing but the bitterness of defeat. In the archives of the International Red Cross, there are reports from 1948 describing the confusion of Arab refugees who were told by their own leaders to leave for a few weeks so that the path would be clear for the conquering armies. These people were told that they would return to a land cleansed of Jews. This promise, documented in radio broadcasts and flyers from the period, was the ultimate betrayal of the Palestinian people by their own leadership. Instead of a state, they were given a catastrophe, a Nakba that was authored in Cairo, Damascus, and Amman. As the war raged through the summer of 1948, the Jewish defenders, often fighting with ancient rifles and homemade explosives, held the line. They were not just fighting for territory, they were fighting for the right to build a future. In the kibbutzim of the Galilee and the outposts of the Negev, the records show a remarkable level of social organization, even under fire. They were planting crops while the shells were falling. They were teaching children in underground bunkers. This intellect of survival is what the Arab leadership failed to account for. They saw the Jews as a weak, displaced people who would flee at the first sight of a tank. They did not understand that the Jewish people were finally home, and they were building a state that was meant to last for eternity. By the time the armistice agreements were signed in 1949, the map of the region had changed. Israel had survived and even expanded its borders beyond the partition lines. But what of the Arab state envisioned by the UN? The territory intended for that state, the West Bank and Gaza, was not turned into a Palestinian republic. Instead, it was occupied by Jordan and Egypt, respectively. For 19 years, from 1949 to 1967, not a single voice in the Arab League called for the creation of an independent Palestinian state in those territories. The archives of the Jordanian parliament from that era show that the West Bank was simply annexed into the Hashemite kingdom, and its residents were made Jordanian subjects. The goal was never Palestinian independence. It was the expansion of existing Arab empires and the eventual destruction of Israel. The narrative of Arabs striving for peace and a state begins to crumble when one examines the minutes of the Arab League meetings during the 1950s. In these secret sessions, the focus remained entirely on the refugee problem as a political weapon. The documents reveal a deliberate policy of keeping the refugees in camps, refusing them citizenship in Arab lands, and denying them the right to build a permanent life. This was done to ensure that the wound of 1948 would never heal, serving as a permanent justification for future wars against the Jewish state. In the archives of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, there are early memos from officials expressing frustration that Arab governments were blocking resettlement projects that would have provided housing and jobs for the displaced. The statehood of the Palestinians was being held hostage by their brothers for the sake of a larger geopolitical game. In the late 1950s, a new figure began to emerge from the shadows of the refugee camps, Yasser Arafat. But his movement, Fatah, was not founded on the principles of civil governance or democratic institution building. It was founded on the principle of armed struggle. The Fatah Charter, which remains a key document in the history of the conflict, does not talk about the peaceful construction of a neighboring state. It talks about the total liberation of Palestine and the eradication of Zionist economic, political, military, and cultural existence. This was not a call for a state west of the Jordan. It was a call for the replacement of the Jewish state. The distinction is crucial, and it is documented in every pamphlet and speech from that era. The struggle was never about where the border would be, but about the fact that there was a border at all. The intelligence files of the Israeli Shin Bet from the 1960s paint a picture of a movement that was more interested in international theater than in local governance. Arafat and his contemporaries traveled from Moscow to Algiers, seeking weapons and revolutionary legitimacy. They were the darlings of the Cold War left, but back in the camps, the infrastructure of a future state remained non-existent. There were no plans for a judiciary, no economic white papers, no vision for a civil society. The only institutions being built were those of terror. The documents recovered from PLO offices in later years show a vast expenditure on propaganda and explosives, but almost nothing on urban planning or public health. The state was a rhetorical device, a slogan to be shouted at the UN, not a reality to be built on the ground. In June of 1967, the world watched as the Arab world mobilized once again for what they promised would be the final battle. The rhetoric from Cairo was more bloodthirsty than ever. President Gamal Abdel Nasser declared on Radio Cairo that the objective will be the destruction of Israel. This was the moment when the mask of seeking a state was dropped entirely. If the Arab goal had been a state in the West Bank and Gaza, they already had those territories under their control. They could have declared a Palestinian state at any moment between 1949 and 1967. They did not. Instead, they used those territories as launch pads for Fedayeen raids and as a staging ground for a war of annihilation. The archives of the Six-Day War show that the Arab armies were not prepared for a defensive struggle of a new nation. They were prepared for a colonial-style conquest of Jewish land. The lightning victory of Israel in 1967 placed the West Bank and Gaza under Israeli control. For the first time, the territories were unified under a single administration, ironically, an Israeli one. The documents from the Israeli civil administration in the late 1960s show a sudden and dramatic increase in the standard of living for the local Arab population. For the first time, modern electricity, water systems, and health care were introduced to villages that had been neglected for decades under Jordanian and Egyptian rule. The Israeli intellect of management was applied to the very people who had been told to hate them. Yet, even as the local economy boomed, the political leadership of the Arab world met in Khartoum and issued the famous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. The offer of land for peace was met with the same wall of rejection that had stood since 1947. The tragedy of the missed opportunities in the 1970s is documented in the secret diaries of Israeli diplomats like Abba Eban. He wrote of the ghosts he chased through the halls of European capitals, Arab moderates who whispered that they wanted a deal but feared the assassin's bullet. The archives of the PLO from this period, many of which were captured during the 1982 war in Lebanon, reveal why peace was so elusive. They contain hit lists of Arab leaders who were suspected of, quote, _35_ with the Zionist entity. The narrative of Palestinian statehood was being policed by a radical elite that viewed any compromise as treason. The __quote _36_ they envisioned was not a partner in peace, but a revolutionary base for the continued struggle. The documents show that the PLO's 10-point program of 1974 explicitly stated that they would establish a national authority on any piece of land they could get, only to use it as a springboard to claim the rest of Israel. This staged plan for the destruction of Israel is the smoking gun of Palestinian diplomacy. It proves that the desire for a state was a tactical maneuver, not a strategic goal. The records of the 1988 Algiers Declaration, where the PLO supposedly recognized the two-state solution, are undermined by the internal memos sent to their cadres. These memos explained that the declaration was a Trojan horse designed to gain international sympathy and weaken Israel from within. The intellectual honesty of the Jewish state, which sought security and peace, was being met with a sophisticated campaign of deception. The archives show that while Israel was making painful concessions, the leadership in Tunis was laughing behind closed doors, confident that their long-term goal of liquidation remained unchanged. The shadow of the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, loomed large over all these decades. His alliance with the Nazis during World War II was not a historical fluke, but a reflection of a shared ideology of elimination. The documents in the German Federal Archives in Koblenz contain the transcripts of his meetings with Hitler and Himmler, where he promised to solve the Jewish question in the Middle East with the same methods used in Europe. This ideological poison did not disappear in 1945. It was passed down through the generations, from the Mufti to his nephew Yasser Arafat, and eventually to the leaders of Hamas. The myth of a peaceful state-building project is refuted by the persistent, documented obsession with the final solution for the Jewish state. In the dusty basement of a former government building in Ramallah, a team of researchers once found a forgotten set of blueprints from the late 1990s. They were not for a parliament, a hospital, or a university. They were for a vast network of tunnels and bunkers designed to hide weapons and fighters in the heart of civilian areas. These blueprints, dated during the height of the Oslo peace process, tell the true story of what was being built. While the world was celebrating handshakes on the White House lawn, the state being prepared on the ground was a fortress of terror. The documents of the Palestinian Authority from that era, seized during Operation Defensive Shield, show that millions of dollars in international aid meant for infrastructure were diverted to pay the salaries of martyrs and to purchase illegal shipments of arms like those found on the Kareen A. The contrast remains as stark today as it was in 1948. Israel is a global leader in technology, medicine, and science, a state of the future that uses its intellect to protect its people and contribute to the world. On the other side, the state that has been in its infancy for 78 years remains a parasite of international aid. governed by a leadership that prioritizes the death of Jews over the life of its own children. The archives of the Gaza Strip under Hamas reveal a society where the only growth industry is the construction of metro tunnels for war. There are no documents in the Hamas archives about economic reform or environmental protection. There are only manuals for kidnapping, instructions for making rockets, and religious decrees justifying the slaughter of innocents. The myth of the state-building Arab is silenced by the reality of the tunnel-digging terrorist. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting long shadows across the ancient stones of Jerusalem, one cannot help but wonder about the folders that remain classified. In the inner sanctums of intelligence agencies, there are transcripts of phone calls and encrypted messages that reveal the private thoughts of the men who claim to want a state. They speak not of prosperity, but of patience until the day of reckoning. They speak of a Palestinian state as a temporary station on the road to a larger caliphate. The truth is buried in the fine print of their charters and the blood-stained pages of their history. It is a truth that many in the West refuse to see, preferring the comfort of a two-state fantasy to the harsh reality of an existential war. The documents do not lie. They only wait for those with the courage to read them. The driver who took the members of the Arab Hire Committee to the airport in 1947 later told a story of a conversation he overheard between two delegates. They were not talking about the borders of their new country or the color of their flag. They were laughing about how quickly the Zionist dream would end once the British left. They were convinced that the sheer weight of the Arab world would crush the little Jewish state in a matter of days. That arrogance, documented in the memoirs of those who were there, was the foundation of their failure. They forgot that the Jewish people were not just fighting for land, but for the very right to exist, a right that is backed by an intellect that has survived the rise and fall of countless empires. The state of the future was built on that intellect, while the myth of the state was built on a foundation of sand and hatred. In the silent halls of the archives, the paper is brittle and the ink is fading, but the message remains clear. Every time a hand was extended in peace, it was met with a fist. Every time a map was drawn, it was torn to pieces. The desire for a state west of the Jordan was never the driving force of the Arab movement. It was merely a mask for the desire to erase the Jewish state from the map. This is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of record. The folders are there, the dates are certain, and the signatures are authentic. The world may choose to ignore the archives, but the archives will never stop telling the truth to those who are willing to listen. The final days of April 1948 saw a flurry of secret cables between the British Foreign Office and their embassies in the Middle East. One such cable, marked Top Secret and found in the FO 371 collection, describes a meeting between a high-ranking British officer and a representative of the Arab League. The Briton asked what would happen to the Jewish civilians if the Arab invasion succeeded. The answer was a chilling silence, followed by a shrug and a comment that fate would take its course. This indifference to human life, documented in the cold language of diplomacy, was the hallmark of the leadership that claimed to be fighting for justice. It was a leadership that had already decided that a Palestinian state was less important than a Jewish graveyard. The tragedy of the 20th century is that this choice was made again and again in 1948, 1967, and 2000. The intellect of Israel is not just about chips and software. It is about the ability to see through the fog of deception. It is the ability to build a flourishing society in the middle of a desert of hostility. The archives of the early years of the state show how the intellect of the people was mobilized to absorb hundreds of thousands of refugees from Arab lands, the forgotten refugees who were never given a right of return or a UN agency of their own. These people did not stay in camps. They became the doctors, engineers, and farmers of a new nation. This is the state of the future in action, a state that turns trauma into triumph, while its enemies turn opportunity into grievance. The contrast is written in the history of every school and hospital built in Israel since 1948. The shadow of the 1947 rejection still hangs over the hills of Samaria and the sands of Gaza. It is a shadow that was cast by men who preferred the pride of a no to the responsibility of a yes. The historical documents show that the path to a state was open, the invitations were sent, and the chairs were set at the table. The fact that the seats remained empty is the most damning evidence of all. It is a silence that speaks louder than any protest or manifesto. It is the silence of a missing state, a state that was never born because its parents were too busy trying to kill the neighbor's child. This is the reality of the __quote_69__ as seen through the cold, unyielding lens of history. As we look at the documents from the most recent rounds of negotiations, the pattern remains unbroken. The same '70 rhetoric, the same refusal to recognize the Jewish state as a permanent reality, the same diversion of funds to the machinery of war. The '71 has become an industry, a global brand that sells victimhood while concealing the true objective. But the archives of the 20th century provide the key to understanding the 21st. They show us that the conflict is not about a state, but about the refusal of a state. It is a conflict between those who build and those who destroy, between those who look to the future and those who are obsessed with erasing the past. The truth is there in the folders and the files for anyone who is willing to look. One final document from the 1948 files deserves mention. It is a letter from a small Arab village near Haifa, written to the local Jewish commander. The villagers asked for protection and expressed their desire to live in peace under the new Jewish administration. They wrote of their fear of the, '72 who were coming from the north. This letter, preserved in the Haganah archives, reminds us that the people themselves often wanted what their leaders denied them. They wanted the, '73, but they were dragged into the, '74 by a leadership that saw them as nothing more than pawns. The tragedy of the Arab rejection is, above all, the tragedy of the Arab people themselves, sacrificed on the altar of a hatred that their leaders could not let go of. The sun has long since set on the British Mandate, and the world has moved on to new crises and new maps. But in the quiet rooms where history is kept, the papers still rustle with the echoes of that first, '75. They tell a story of a choice made in 1947, a choice that defined the next 80 years. It was a choice between building a home and burning down the neighbor's house. The records show that the desire for a state was always a secondary consideration, a piece of political stagecraft used to hide a more radical intent. This is the truth that the archives reveal, a truth that is both logical and tragic. It is the truth of a state that could have been, but was never allowed to exist by the very people who claimed to want it most. The folders of the UN Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, contain the testimonies of those who lived through that turning point. They show the meticulous preparation of the Jewish Agency and the total boycott by the Arab Higher Committee. This boycott was not a protest against injustice. It was a refusal to participate in the very process of state creation. If you do not show up to the meeting where the state is being designed, can you truly say you want the state? The documents suggest otherwise. They suggest a leadership that was waiting for a different outcome, an outcome that did not involve diplomacy, but blood. This is the intellectual investigation of our history, the discovery that the myth of the striving Arab state was actually a strategy of waiting for the Jewish state to fall. The documents are silent on many things, but they are loud on this. The Jewish state was born because it had to be, and the Palestinian state was not born because its leaders didn't want it to be. They wanted the land, but they didn't want the state, not if it meant living in peace with Israel. The state of the future was built on the ruins of that rejection, a testament to the power of a people who chose life over destruction. As we continue to examine the archives, the picture becomes even clearer, the details more vivid, and the conclusion more unavoidable. The truth is hidden in plain sight, waiting for the world to stop listening to the slogans and start reading the records. A specific file from the British Colonial Office, numbered CO733, contains the final reports on the economic viability of the proposed Arab state in 1948. The British experts concluded that with the infrastructure being built by the Jews, the Arab state could flourish through trade and cooperation. The potential was there. The resources were there. The only thing missing was the will of the leadership. Instead of a flourishing economy, the Arab leadership chose the path of the long war. This decision is documented in the minutes of the Arab League's military committee, which prioritized the purchase of artillery over the development of agriculture. The __83__ of the peace-loving state builder dies in the face of these cold, hard numbers. The narrative of the __84__ is a modern invention, a product of late 20th century public relations. The original documents from the 1948 era show a different reality, a confident, aggressive movement that believed it could erase the Jewish presence with ease. When that aggression failed, the narrative shifted from _85 to _86. But the underlying goal, the liquidation of the Jewish state, remained the same. This consistency is documented in the charters of the PLO and Hamas, and in the school books of the Palestinian Authority. The _87 is always a means to an end, never the end itself. The intellectual challenge for the world is to stop falling for the mask and start recognizing the face behind it. In the secret archives of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, there is a report from 1972 about a meeting with a high-level Soviet diplomat. The Russian told his Israeli counterpart that the ___88___ was the most effective weapon the Soviet Union had ever deployed in the Middle East. He admitted that it was a, quote, _89, quote, movement, designed to destabilize the region and weaken the Western-aligned Jewish state. This document sheds a new light on the __quote _90 __. It was not a grassroots movement for independence. It was a Cold War project, fueled by Moscow and executed by the Arab world. The quote 91 was a slogan written in the Kremlin and spoken in Arabic. The archives of the 1980s and 90s show how this __quote _92 was used to extract billions of dollars from the international community. The records of the European Union's aid programs to the Palestinian territories are a study in mismanagement and corruption. The documents show that while schools and hospitals were built on paper, the money was often funneled into the private accounts of the leadership or into the martyr funds that incentivized terror. The state was a business, a way for a small elite to get rich while keeping their people in a state of permanent mobilization. The myth of the state builder is refuted by the reality of the kleptocrat. As we look back at the original documents from 1947, the clarity of the Jewish vision stands in stark contrast to the chaos of the Arab response. One side saw a state as a sacred responsibility. The other saw it as a temporary inconvenience on the way to a greater victory. The intellect of Israel was the foundation of the state, a foundation that has proven to be unshakable. The myth of the Palestinian state was a shadow play, a performance for the international community that never intended to yield a peaceful neighbor. The documents prove that the state west of the Jordan was always there for the taking, but the leaders of the Arab world preferred to keep the wound open, to keep the war alive, and to keep the pushing into the sea as their ultimate unyielding goal. There is a final haunting image in the archives of the 1948 war. It is a photograph of a Jewish family in Jerusalem, huddled in a basement during the bombardment. The father is teaching his son from a Hebrew book, while the mother prepares a meager meal. Even in the face of annihilation, the focus was on education, on culture, on the future. This is the secret of the state of the future. It is not just about the strength of the army, but about the strength of the spirit and the intellect. It is a spirit that the Arab leadership of that time could not understand and could not defeat. And it is a spirit that continues to define Israel today, a beacon of logic and light in a region still shadowed by the myths of the past. The folders are closed now, the lights in the archive are dimmed, and the silence returns to the corridors of history. But the questions remain, echoing in the air like the ghost of a missed opportunity. Why did they say no? Why did they choose war over a state? The answer is not found in the rhetoric of today, but in the documents of yesterday. It is an answer that is as clear as the ink on the partition plan and as tragic as the blood on the maps. The truth is not a mystery. It is a matter of record. And that record tells a story of a state that was offered, a state that was rejected, and a people who are still paying the price for the choices made by their leaders in the winter of 1947. In the shadows of the old city, there is a small room that once served as a command post for the Arab defenders of 1948. On the wall, there is still a map, hand-drawn and stained with age. It does not show a Palestinian state next to Israel. It shows a map of a land where Israel does not exist at all. This map is the most honest document of all. It is the visual representation of the, quote, myth and the, quote, truth. It shows that from the very beginning the goal was not our state, but not their state. As long as that map remains the guiding vision for the leadership in Ramallah and Gaza, the, quote, state in its infancy will never grow up, and the peace that the world craves will remain a distant, elusive dream. The archives of the British High Commission contain one last entry from May 14, 1948. It is a simple observation about the weather. The day is warm, the sky is clear, but the horizon is clouded by the smoke of 100 fires. Those fires were lit by the Refusal of 1947, and they have been kept burning by a narrative that prizes the destruction of the other over the construction of the self. The intellect of survival has carried Israel through those fires, but the myth of the state has left the Palestinian people wandering in the smoke. The tragedy is that the door to the state was always open, but the keys were thrown into the sea by those who claimed to be its guardians. The rejection of the 1947 partition plan was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but the opening chord of a symphony of refusal that would play for the next 70 years. As the dust settled on the battlefields of 1948, the narrative of the Arab leadership shifted from the hope of a quick conquest to the reality of a long, grinding war of attrition. The smoke of the first conflict did not dissipate. It became a permanent fog that obscured the true intentions of those who claimed to represent the Palestinian people. In the years following the war, while Israel was building cities and absorbing hundreds of thousands of immigrants, the Arab leadership was consolidating a strategy that had nothing to do with building a state. The documents from the Jordanian military headquarters in Amman, dated 1955, reveal a preoccupation with the inevitable second round. There was no mention of creating a Palestinian administration in the West Bank or Gaza. Instead, there were detailed maps of Israeli infrastructure and plans for synchronized attacks. In the 1960s, the emergence of the Palestine Liberation Organization under the shadow of the Arab League marked a new era in the marketing of the conflict. The founding charter of the organization, published in 1964, is a document that remains one of the most revealing pieces of evidence in the history of the region. It explicitly states that the partition of Palestine in 1947 and the establishment of Israel were illegal and null and void. It did not call for a state alongside Israel. It called for the liberation of Palestine through armed struggle, which it defined as the only way to eliminate Zionism. The archives of the Egyptian Foreign Ministry from this period show how President Nasser used the organization as a proxy for his own regional ambitions. The Palestinian cause was being shaped into a political weapon that could be wielded by any Arab capital that wanted to project power. The welfare of the people living in the refugee camps was an afterthought, buried under layers of revolutionary rhetoric and cold geopolitical calculation. The events of September 1970, known to history as Black September, provide a chilling look at the true priorities of the Palestinian leadership. Yasser Arafat and his Fatah fighters, having been expelled from the West Bank after the Six-Day War, did not focus their energy on building an underground government or a civil society for their people. Instead, they attempted to overthrow the Jordanian monarchy. The internal reports of the Jordanian intelligence services, known as the Mukhabarat, detail how the Palestinian militias created a state within a state in the streets of Amman, terrorizing the local population and challenging the sovereignty of King Hussein. The violence that followed was not a struggle against Zionism, but a fratricidal war for power in an Arab land. This moment revealed a fundamental truth. For the leadership of the movement, the state was not a geographic location or a civic project, but a portable base for revolutionary activity. When they were expelled from Jordan, they moved to Lebanon, where they repeated the same pattern, leading that once prosperous country into a decade of civil war and ruin. In the 1970s, the intellect of terror became increasingly sophisticated, moving from the battlefields of the Middle East to the international stage. The hijacking of airplanes, the massacre at the Munich Olympics in 1972, and the attacks on schools and buses were all part of a strategy to make the existence of Israel unbearable. But behind the violence, there was a deeper, more subtle game being played. In 1974, the Palestine Liberation Organization adopted what became known as the 10-Point Program, or the Phased Plan. The documents from the Cairo meeting, found in the archives of the Arab League, outline a strategy of obtaining any territory through diplomacy, only to use it as a base for the liberation of the rest. This was the intellectual foundation of the state narrative, a tactical compromise designed to lead to an absolute victory. It was a masterpiece of doublespeak, allowing the leadership to talk about peace in English to the Western press, while promising total destruction in Arabic to their followers. The 1990s brought the world to the lawns of the White House for the signing of the Oslo Accords. To the casual observer, it seemed as though the myth of the state builder was finally becoming a reality. The Palestinian Authority was established, and for the first time, an Arab administration had control over major population centers in the West Bank and Gaza. But the archives tell a different story. In 1994, just weeks after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, Yasser Arafat traveled to Johannesburg, South Africa. In a mosque there, thinking he was not being recorded by Western ears, he gave a speech that would later be discovered and analyzed by Israeli intelligence. He compared the Oslo Accords to the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, a temporary truce made by the Prophet Muhammad with his enemies, only to be broken when he became strong enough to conquer them. This Hudaybiyah strategy was the secret operating manual of the Palestinian Authority throughout the peace process. While the world was sending billions of dollars to build a state, the leadership was building a war machine. A young Israeli intelligence officer, whose name remains classified in the archives of the Prime Minister's office, spent his nights in the mid-90s translating intercepted faxes and phone calls from the Muqatta, the Palestinian headquarters in Ramallah. He noticed a disturbing pattern. Every time a major step toward statehood was on the horizon, a wave of suicide bombings would derail the process. The documents seized during later military operations proved that these attacks were not the work of, quote, 124, quote, or, quote, 125, quote. They were often coordinated with the knowledge, and sometimes the active support, of the Palestinian security forces. The intelligence officer realized that the leadership was terrified of the responsibilities of a real state, the need to collect taxes, maintain a judiciary, and live in peace with a neighbor. They preferred the perpetual, quote, underscore 126, underscore, which allowed them to maintain their power and their flow of international aid without the burden of governance. The Camp David Summit in the summer of 2000 was the ultimate test of the statehood narrative. President Bill Clinton and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered Yasser Arafat a deal that would have created an independent Palestinian state in over 90% of the West Bank and all of Gaza, with a capital in East Jerusalem. It was the realization of the supposed dream of decades. Yet, as the transcripts of the summit reveal, Arafat did not even make a counteroffer. He simply said, quote, 127, quote. President Clinton later wrote in his memoirs that Arafat was, quote, 128, quote. The archives show that Arafat returned home not to prepare his people for peace, but to launch the Second Intifada, a 4-year campaign of terror that destroyed the hopes of an entire generation. The decision to choose fire over a flag is the most powerful evidence that the quote 129 was never the primary goal. The rise of Hamas in the mid-90s and its eventual takeover of the Gaza Strip in 2007 added a new theological layer to the rejection. The Hamas Covenant, published in 1988 and still the guiding document of the movement, is a chilling read. It quotes the infamous, quote, 130, and explicitly states that, quote, 131. It rejects any international conferences or peaceful initiatives as a, quote, 132. This is not the language of a nationalist movement seeking a state. It is the language of a religious cult seeking a global revolution. The archives of the Gaza Strip, captured during various conflicts, show that every resource available to the Hamas administration was diverted to the construction of, quote, 133, quote, the, quote, 134, quote, of tunnels beneath the streets of Gaza is a monumental feat of engineering, costing hundreds of millions of dollars. If that same intellect and those same resources had been used to build hospitals, power plants, and schools, Gaza could have been the, quote, 135. Instead, Gaza became a laboratory for a new kind of warfare, a, quote, 136 strategy that deliberately places military assets in the middle of civilian populations. The documents recovered from the Shifa Hospital and other locations show how the leadership uses the suffering of its own people as a propaganda tool to gain international sympathy. This is the dark side of the quote, 7 in the Arab sector, a sophisticated manipulation of the global media and international law to protect a regime of terror. The archives of the United Nations show that time and again, reports were filed about the misuse of schools and clinics by armed groups, only to be ignored or suppressed by those who preferred the narrative of Palestinian victimhood. The, quote, 138 in Gaza was not built to protect the people, but to use the people as a shield for the, quote, 139 of the Jewish state. The contrast with the Israeli, quote, 140 could not be more dramatic. In the archives of the Israeli Innovation Authority, one can track the development of technologies that have changed the world. Drip irrigation, the USB flash drive, the Iron Dome, and breakthroughs in cancer research. This is the, quote, 141, a mindset that asks how to make the world better even while under constant threat. Israel has built a society where the military is a necessity, but the civilian life is the priority. The documents show that even during the height of the various intifadas, the Israeli economy continued to grow, fueled by a relentless pursuit of knowledge and excellence. This is the, quote, 142 that brings the people together. A shared mission to be a, quote, 143 through practical, tangible achievements. In the early 21st century, The ___quote _144_ was given a new life through the ___ quote _145_ narrative. The archives of the Palestinian Authority's Ministry of Information show a massive investment in teaching the new generation that their real home is not in the West Bank or Gaza, but in the cities and villages of pre-1948 Israel. This is a deliberate psychological strategy to ensure that any future state in the territories would only be seen as a temporary station. The documents from the school system in Ramallah and Gaza showed textbooks that do not even feature the word Israel on their maps. Instead, the entire land is labeled Palestine, and children are taught that the Zionist entity is a colonial intruder that must be expelled. By educating children for a return that can never happen, the leadership is ensuring that the conflict will never end. They are building a generation of refugees, not a generation of citizens. The financial records of the Palestinian leadership, many of which were exposed by investigative journalists and later confirmed by intelligence reports, show a staggering level of wealth among the elite. While the people in the camps of Lebanon and Syria live in squalor, the leaders in Tunis, Ramallah, and Gaza have amassed fortunes in international bank accounts. The archives of the World Bank contain numerous reports from the early 2000s warning about the lack of transparency and the leakage of funds within the Palestinian Authority. This is the intellect of the kleptocrat, using a national cause as a front for a massive criminal enterprise. The state is the product they sell to the world, but the struggle is the engine that generates their personal wealth. As long as there is no state, there is no accountability, and the flow of aid continues. The files of the Israeli Shin Bet from the period of the Karine A affair in 2002 provide a definitive look at the true priorities of the Arafat era. The ship, which was intercepted in the Red Sea, was carrying 50 tons of sophisticated Iranian weaponry, long-range rockets, anti-tank missiles, and high-grade explosives. The documents found on board linked the shipment directly to the highest levels of the Palestinian Authority. At the very moment when Arafat was promising the world that he was fighting for a peaceful state, he was importing the tools for a massive escalation of the war. This Karine A document is the physical proof of the deception. It shows that the state was merely a mask, and the peace process was a period of rearmament. The intelligence revealed that the plan was to use these weapons to turn the West Bank into a launching pad for attacks that would make the previous Intifada look like a minor skirmish. In the halls of the United Nations in Geneva, there is a room filled with the records of the Human Rights Council. A look at the transcripts reveals a relentless obsession with Israel, while the internal abuses of the Palestinian leadership are almost never mentioned. The documents show a pattern of suppressing dissent, arresting journalists, and torturing political rivals in the prisons of Jericho and Gaza. This is the state that currently exists west of the Jordan, a landscape of authoritarianism and fear. The historical record shows that whenever the Palestinian people have tried to organize for a different future, one based on civil rights and economic cooperation, they have been crushed by their own leaders. The archives of the Arab Spring in the Palestinian territories are particularly tragic, showing how young activists who wanted to end the division were silenced by both Fatah and Hamas. The intellect of defense that Israel has developed is a direct response to this 70-year history of rejection. The development of the Arrow missile system, the David's sling, and the sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities are not just technical achievements, they are the physical manifestation of a nation's will to live. The archives of the Israeli Ministry of Defense show that these systems were often built in record time, driven by the knowledge that there is no Plan B for the Jewish state. This is the patriotism of the future, a commitment to protecting the people not just through force, but through a technological edge that makes the liquidation of the state impossible. The documents show that while the enemies of Israel are obsessed with the past, Israel is building a shield that allows it to live in the future. One of the most revealing documents in the history of the conflict is a secret memorandum from the Saudi Arabian government leaked in 2017. It describes a new peace plan that reflects the growing frustration of the Arab world with the Palestinian leadership. The memo notes that the Palestinians have missed every opportunity for a state since 1948, and that the time has come for the Arab world to move on and build a new future with Israel. This reflects the reality of the Abraham Accords, a historic realignment where the intellect of the future in the Arab world has recognized that the old myths are no longer sustainable. The archives of the signing of these accords show a new kind of map, a map of trade, of energy cooperation, and of shared security. It is a map that includes Israel as a vital, permanent part of the region, much to the anger of the rejectionists in Ramallah and Gaza. The tragedy of the myth is that it continues to claim lives long after its logical foundation has collapsed. The archives of the October 7, 2023 massacre are the latest, most horrific chapter in this history. The documents recovered from the bodies of the terrorists, hand-drawn maps, instructions for the execution of civilians, and religious justifications for atrocities show that the goal of pushing the Jews into the sea is not a metaphor. It is a literal, tactical objective. This was not a move toward a state. It was a move toward an apocalypse. The intelligence shows that the planners of the attack hoped to trigger a regional war that would destroy the entire fabric of Middle Eastern society. This is the ultimate intellect of the void, a leadership so obsessed with the death of their neighbor that they are willing to burn their own people to the ground to achieve it. As we look at the contemporary archives, the contrast between the two societies has never been sharper. In Israel, the documents of the startup nation continue to be written every day in the labs of the Weizmann Institute and the offices of Tel Aviv. It is a society that is constantly self-correcting, debating its own future, and striving for a more perfect democracy. On the other side, the state remains a ghost, a series of slogans and symbols that hide a reality of stagnation and despair. The archives of the Palestinian Authority's debt and the records of Hamas's tunnel networks tell a story of a leadership that has failed its people in every measurable way. The truth is that the state west of the Jordan was always possible, but it was never the priority. The priority was, and remains, the elimination of the Jewish state. The driver of a high-ranking Palestinian official once spoke to an Israeli journalist off the record. He described his boss's house, a palace of marble and gold, with air conditioning that never failed even when the rest of the city was in darkness. He said that his boss would often talk about the, quote, 177, while sipping expensive French cognac. This image, documented in the journalist's notes, is the reality of the cause. It is a business, a brand, and a shield for a corrupt elite. The people are only useful when they are suffering, because their suffering is the fuel that keeps the money flowing. This is why the desire for a state remains a myth. A real state would require transparency, it would require borders, and it would require an end to the eternal struggle that keeps the elite in power. The shadow of 1948 still lies heavy on the land, but the light of the state of the future is growing stronger. The documents show that every attempt to destroy Israel has only made it more resilient, more innovative, and more united. The intellect of survival has become the intellect of prosperity. The archives of the 20th and 21st centuries tell a consistent story. One people building a future out of a desert, and another people's leadership trying to turn that future into a desert. The truth is too dangerous for many to blown, because it challenges the very foundation of the modern international narrative. It suggests that the conflict is not about borders or settlements, but about a fundamental choice between life and death. As the sun rises over the hills of Judea, it illuminates the skyscrapers of Tel Aviv and the ancient walls of Jerusalem. It also shines on the quiet rooms of the archives, where the truth is kept on paper and in digital files. The story is all there, the offers that were made, the maps that were drawn, and the hands that were pulled back. The myth of the striving state builder is a tragedy of lost potential, a story of a leadership that chose to stay in the infancy of a revolutionary movement rather than grow into the responsibility of a nation. The documents are a testament to what could have been and a warning about what will be if the symphony of refusal continues to play. The truth is documented, it is verified, and it is waiting for those who are brave enough to face it. The final folders of the 21st century files are still being written. They contain the records of new technologies, new alliances, and new challenges. But they also contain the same old patterns of incitement and rejection. The intellect of the future must navigate these waters with both strength and wisdom. The archives show that the Jewish state has succeeded not just because of its weapons, but because of its logic, its creativity, and its unwavering commitment to its own existence. The myth may continue to be shouted at the UN and written in the newspapers of Europe, but the truth is written in the soil of Israel and in the pages of its history. It is a truth that is both logical and inspiring, a story of a people who refused to be pushed into the sea and instead built a state that reached for the stars. In the dusty corner of a warehouse in an undisclosed location, there is a crate filled with the personal effects of a high-ranking official from the early days of the Palestinian Authority. Among the papers is a small notebook written in a cramped, hurried hand. The last entry, dated just before a major summit, does not contain a plan for a constitution or a vision for a new economy. It is a single sentence, repeated over and over again, as if the writer was trying to convince himself. The end will justify the means. This notebook, a small and seemingly insignificant artifact, is perhaps the most honest document of all. It is the final piece of the puzzle, a window into the mind of a movement that has spent 70 years sacrificing the means of a state for an end that history has already proven to be an impossibility. The notebook sits in the dark, a silent witness to a tragedy that was entirely avoidable, a tragedy that continues to be written in the blood and ink of a land that is still waiting for a yes that may never come. The lights in the archive are turned off, and the heavy doors are locked. The silence that follows is not a silence of peace, but a silence of heavy secrets. The world outside continues to talk about maps and borders, about two states and peace processes. But inside these walls, the documents tell a different story. A story of a choice made in 1947 and confirmed every decade since. The myth is a powerful force, capable of moving millions and shaping the policies of empires. But the truth is a solid thing, a collection of dates, names, and signatures that cannot be erased. It is a truth that belongs to the state of the future, a state that has learned that the only way to protect itself is to know exactly what it is fighting against. The archive remains, a storehouse of reality in a world of illusions, waiting for the day when the documents are finally allowed to speak for themselves. The last document for today is a simple receipt from a shipping company in 1948, found in a forgotten file in the port of Haifa. It shows a delivery of hundreds of crates of paper and ink ordered by the Jewish agency in the final weeks of the mandate. They were preparing to print the laws, the stamps, and the textbooks of a new nation. On the same day, in the same port, there is no record of any such order from the Arab Higher Committee. They were not ordering paper. They were ordering weapons. The contrast of those two ledgers, one for the tools of building and one for the tools of destruction, is the most concise summary of the last 80 years. The paper was used to write the declaration of a state that changed the world, while the weapons were used in a war that only brought misery to those who started it. The ink has long since dried, but the choice remains as clear today as it was on that spring afternoon in 1948.